My wife said I was broke and powerless. She didn't know who controlled the accounts, and this is my real-life story, so it is the life lesson for others, so please like and subscribe. So my name is Daniel Cross, and I am 53 years old as I sit with this memory, letting it breathe again, even though part of me would rather keep it buried, because this is not a story that begins with drama or shouting or plates flying across a room. It begins with something far colder, far more cutting. The kind of moment that doesn't explode but freezes you from the inside out. The kind of moment that changes how you hear your own name forever. And I remember it clearly, every detail. The way the late afternoon light came through the living room window, hitting the edge of the coffee table, the faint hum of the air conditioner, the smell of polish on the wood floor, all the normal things that made our house feel like home for 3 decades. Except that day it didn't feel like home at all. It felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided, and my wife stood there, Laura, the woman I had loved since my 20s, arms crossed tight against her chest, not defensive, not nervous, just firm, like she had practiced this moment in her head more than once. And she looked at me the way you look at an old piece of furniture you're about to throw out. Not angry, not emotional, just finished. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost bored, which somehow hurt more than if she had screamed, because boredom means you don't matter anymore. And she said my name, Daniel, slowly, like she was explaining something obvious to a child. And then she said it, "You're broke, you're powerless, and you're in my way." And that was it. No pause for discussion, no explanation, no room for misunderstanding. Just a sentence dropped into the middle of our life like a stone through glass. And I remember blinking, honestly blinking, because my brain couldn't catch up to my ears. And I wondered for a split second if I had misheard her, if maybe I was tired, if maybe she had said something else. But no, the words were clear, broke and powerless, after 30 years of marriage. After all the nights I stayed up working while she slept, after all the weekends I skipped because I was building something for us, after everything I had built quietly, carefully, patiently, she looked at me and saw nothing. And what shocked me most wasn't the insult. It was the certainty in her voice. The confidence that she had already decided who I was and what I was worth. And I felt something shift inside my chest. Not like anger rising, not like tears forming, but like a switch being flipped off. Something clean and final. And I stood there with my hands hanging at my sides, feeling the slight shake in my fingers, seeing the gray in my own reflection on the dark TV screen behind her, and thinking, is this really how it ends? Is this the moment everything I believed about my life just collapses into a single sentence? And the strange thing is, part of me wanted to argue, to defend myself, to list every sacrifice, every late night, every decision I made for us. But another part of me, a quieter part, older, wiser, told me to stay still, to listen, because people reveal who they really are when they think you can't hurt them anymore. And Laura thought that. She truly believed I was done. She believed I was a man past his usefulness, a man who had stepped aside and lost control. And she didn't know. She had no idea about the accounts, about the structures, about the long-term decisions I had made years ago when things were still good, when love still existed. Decisions meant to protect us from the world. Decisions I never talked about because I didn't need applause. And she didn't know that the man standing in front of her, silent, slightly shaking, wasn't powerless at all. He was just patient, and patience can look a lot like weakness to someone who only understands noise. And as she kept talking, explaining what she thought would happen next, how things would be divided, how she would be fine and I would have to adjust, I felt myself drifting inward, listening less to her words and more to the realization settling into my bones. The realization that the woman I loved had already left me emotionally long before this conversation, that this wasn't a fight. It was a declaration. And in that moment, I wasn't thinking about revenge or justice or proving her wrong. I was thinking about survival, about dignity, about whether I would let this be the story of my ending or the beginning of something else entirely. And I remember asking myself a simple question, one that changed everything. What happens when someone mistakes silence for surrender? And the answer came quietly, calmly, with a strange sense of clarity. They get careless. And Laura was careless. Careless enough to say those words out loud. Careless enough to believe them. careless enough to think the ground beneath her feet was solid. And as I stood there, listening, nodding, letting her believe she was right, I felt that switch inside me lock into place, not with rage, not with hatred, but with resolve, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that waits. And I realized that day, standing in my own living room, being told I was broke and powerless by the woman who once promised to stand beside me forever, that sometimes your own house is where the first betrayal happened, and sometimes the most dangerous man in the room is the one everyone thinks is already finished. Before I became the quiet man people barely noticed, before my own wife could look at me and say I was powerless without a hint of doubt, I was someone entirely different. And to understand how easily I was dismissed later, you have to understand how intensely I lived earlier. Because in my 20s and 30s I was anything but invisible. I was loud without meaning to be, driven without needing motivation. The kind of man who woke up before the alarm and went to bed with his mind still racing, chasing deals, systems, deadlines, and opportunities like they were oxygen. And back then I believed, like a lot of men do, that if you worked hard enough, stayed loyal enough, and built something solid enough, respect and security would naturally follow you forever. And my work reflected that belief. I wasn't in flashy finance, no trading floors, no shouting into phones, no shiny offices with glass walls and city views. I was deep in financial systems, the invisible backbone of companies, the part no one talks about at dinner parties, back-end structures, compliance frameworks, account flows, authorization chains, the boring stuff people roll their eyes at until something breaks and suddenly it's the most important thing in the room. And I was good at it, frighteningly good, because I understood not just how money moved, but why it moved, who controlled it, where it could get stuck, and how to protect it from both stupidity and greed. And those early years were exhausting but satisfying. I felt useful, respected, needed. I was the guy people called when things went wrong, the guy who didn't panic, who fixed quietly and moved on. And Laura loved that version of me, or at least she loved what it gave her. The stability, the upward movement, the sense that she was attached to a man going somewhere. And we built a life around that momentum, promotions, a bigger house, better neighborhoods, nicer dinners, and for a long time it felt balanced, like we were climbing together. But somewhere along the way, probably when I hit my early 40s, something in me shifted, not because I was tired or burned out, but because I had seen enough to know how fragile everything really was. I had watched companies collapse from one bad assumption, watched marriages explode over money misunderstandings, watched men lose everything because they confused speed with strength. And I decided quietly, without announcing it, to slow down, to move from chasing growth to building protection, from expansion to stability. And that decision made perfect sense to me, but it looked very different from the outside. Because when I stepped back, Laura stepped forward. She found her world in social circles, charity boards, fundraising dinners, business lunches where names mattered more than substance, where image mattered more than structure, and she was good at it. She shined in rooms where I felt drained. She loved being seen, being admired, being associated with influence. And while she climbed socially, I became background noise. The man standing slightly behind her, holding coats, smiling politely, listening more than speaking. And I let that happen, not out of insecurity, but because I genuinely believed my role had changed, that my value didn't need an audience anymore. And there's a strange freedom in being underestimated that people don't talk about. When folks stop watching you closely, when they stop asking what you're doing or why, when they assume you're out of the game, you gain space, room to think, room to plan, room to act without interference. And during those years I handled our finances the same way I handled everything important, quietly, legally, transparently. But with strategy, I built layers into our financial life. Safeguards that most people never think about until it's too late. Long-term structures designed not for growth but for survival, for protection, for control. And I didn't do it because I distrusted Laura, at least not consciously. I did it because I distrusted chaos, because I had seen how fast circumstances change, how quickly confidence turns into panic, And I believed that loving someone meant making sure neither of you could be destroyed by a single bad decision or unexpected turn. But Laura never saw it that way. To her, money was supposed to be visible, loud, impressive, something you showed off, something that proved you mattered. She called my approach boring, outdated, overly cautious. She'd joke about how I treated finances like a basement utility room instead of a living room centerpiece. And I'd shrug and let her talk because arguing felt pointless, because I thought results would speak louder than explanations, and because deep down I still believed we were on the same team. That even if she didn't understand what I did anymore, she trusted me to do it. And that assumption, that quiet trust, was my biggest blind spot. Because while I was building systems meant to protect us both, she was building a story about who she was and who I had become. A story where I was no longer the driver but the passenger, no longer the builder but the beneficiary. And over time that story hardened into belief. Not just for her but for everyone around us, friends, acquaintances, people who saw her confidence and mistook my calm for decline. And I noticed it, of course I did, the subtle dismissals, the jokes about me being old school, the way conversations shifted away from me. But I told myself it didn't matter, that respect earned quietly was stronger than respect demanded loudly. And in many ways that's true, but it only works when both people understand the difference between quiet strength and absence. And Laura didn't. She saw my silence as surrender, my patience as passivity, my caution as fear. And while I was focused on protecting the foundation, she was busy rearranging the furniture and taking credit for the house. And the cruel irony is that the very things she dismissed as boring, the safeguards, the layers, the long-term planning, were the things that would later define who actually held power. But back then none of that mattered because perception had already shifted, and perception, when left unchecked, becomes reality in people's minds. And by the time Laura looked at me and truly believed I was powerless, she had been rehearsing that belief for years, reinforced by my own decision to stay quiet, to let her shine, to let myself fade into the background. And I see it clearly now, with the kind of painful clarity only hindsight gives you, that being underestimated is only an advantage if you're still seen as relevant. Once you're seen as obsolete, the ground beneath you becomes dangerous. Because people stop respecting limits, stop asking permission, stop considering your presence at all. And that's where I was before everything fell apart. A man with decades of experience, control, and quiet authority, standing in plain sight, invisible by choice at first, invisible by assumption later, underestimated not because I lacked value, but because I let the world and my wife believe I had stopped mattering, and that belief, once it took hold, set the stage for everything that came next. Things didn't fall apart overnight, and that's what makes this part so hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived through it, because people like clean breaks and clear villains, but real betrayal is usually quiet, slow, almost polite, like water wearing down stone, until one day you realize the shape has changed, and you don't remember when it started. And that's exactly how it happened with Laura and me. Because at first it was just little things that felt harmless on their own. The kind of moments you brush off because you don't want to be dramatic or paranoid, like the way she'd correct me in public with a light laugh, not sharp enough to cause a scene, but just sharp enough to sting. Saying things like, "Daniel doesn't really understand this stuff anymore," or "Don't worry, I handle the important decisions now," and people would chuckle politely, nodding along, because confidence is contagious and doubt is uncomfortable. And I'd smile too, because that's what you do when you don't want to look insecure. But every time it happened, something inside me tightened, like a knot slowly pulling itself closed. And I told myself it was nothing, that couples evolve, that roles change, that I was being oversensitive. But those moments started stacking up, one on top of the other, until they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. And the worst part wasn't the comments themselves. It was the ease with which she said them. The certainty that she was now the authority and I was the outdated reference. And when we were alone at home, where things should have been safer, warmer, more honest, the shift was even clearer, because conversations stopped being conversations and started feeling like negotiations. Like every interaction had a cost attached to it. Every decision came with an unspoken scorecard. Affection became conditional in a way that's hard to describe unless you felt it, because it wasn't withheld dramatically. It was rationed, measured, granted when I agreed, and quietly removed when I didn't. And if I questioned something, even gently, the room would go cold, the warmth would drain out of her voice, and I'd suddenly feel like I'd violated some unspoken rule. And over time I learned that nodding was easier than questioning. Silence was safer than disagreement. And that's a dangerous lesson for a man to learn in his own marriage. Because once you stop speaking freely, you stop existing fully. And Laura noticed that. I'm sure she did. Because she stopped asking my opinion altogether, stopped checking in before making decisions that affected both of us, stopped pretending we were partners instead of separate entities sharing a roof. And I remember the strange loneliness of sitting across from her at the dinner table, listening to her talk about plans she had already made, trips she had already discussed with others, commitments she had already promised, and realizing I was hearing about my own life as if it belonged to someone else. And that feeling of being edited out of your own story is a special kind of pain, quiet but relentless. And then there were the names, unfamiliar names popping up on her phone, texts she'd glance at and quickly turn away from, calls she'd take in the other room. And when I asked, casually, carefully, she'd say they were business partners, networking contacts, people who mattered now, and maybe that was true, maybe it wasn't. But what mattered more than who they were was how quickly she dismissed my right to even ask, like curiosity itself was an accusation, like trust meant silence. And slowly, without ever saying it out loud, she began treating me less like a husband and more like an obstacle she had learned how to manage. And the night it all crystallized for me came during an argument about money. Not a shouting match, not a dramatic blow-up. Just another tired disagreement where I questioned a decision she had already made. And she laughed, actually laughed in that way people do when they think they've already won. And she said, "Relax, you don't even have access anymore." And the room seemed to tilt when she said it. Because in that single sentence I heard everything she believed about me, that I was out of the loop, out of control, irrelevant. And for a moment I almost corrected her, almost told her how wrong she was. Almost reminded her who I was and what I had built, but something stopped me, something deep and steady. And instead of reacting, I listened, really listened, not just to her words but to the confidence behind them, the certainty that she had already locked me out of my own life. And that's when I knew the shift was complete, that love had turned into a transaction, that my value in her eyes was now measured by compliance rather than partnership. And I understood something else too, something important. That when someone believes they've already stripped you of power, they get careless, they say too much, they stop hiding their assumptions, and they reveal their strategy without realizing it. And I saw clearly in that moment that Laura thought she had already won a game I hadn't even acknowledged we were playing. And I didn't correct her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. Because sometimes the smartest move isn't proving someone wrong immediately. It's letting them keep talking while they dig their own hole. And as I sat there, listening to her explain how things were now, how she was handling everything, how I should just trust her and stay out of the way, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not peace, not relief, but clarity. The kind that arrives when illusion finally falls away. And I realized that the erosion was complete. That the marriage I thought I was protecting had already been redefined without my consent. And that from this point on, every word she spoke wasn't just conversation. It was evidence, and every assumption she made about my powerlessness was a mistake she would one day have to face. Because love can turn into a transaction slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. But once you see it for what it is, you can never unsee it. And from that night forward, I stopped reacting as a husband trying to save something and started observing as a man preparing for the truth to finally surface. The real betrayal didn't arrive with shouting or tears or a dramatic confession the way movies make you expect. It arrived quietly, wrapped in paper, sitting between us on the dining table like it belonged there, like it was just another document among bills and invitations. And that's what made it so brutal, because one ordinary evening Laura asked me to sit down, her tone polite, almost professional, and without any build-up, without even looking me in the eye. She slid an envelope across the table toward me, not fast, not slow, just enough to make sure I noticed it. And I remember staring at it for a moment longer than necessary, already knowing what it was before my hands even touched it, because something in her posture told me this wasn't a discussion. It was a delivery. And when I opened it and saw the words staring back at me, divorce petition, legal language stripped of emotion, my first feeling wasn't anger or sadness. It was disbelief at how cleanly she had cut me out of the process. No warning, no attempt at counseling, no late-night conversation where someone says maybe we should talk, just paperwork. As if 30 years together could be reduced to a file prepared by someone who had never seen us laugh or struggle or build a life from nothing. And Laura sat there watching me with a confidence that felt rehearsed, almost smug, like she was relieved to finally be saying something she had been holding in for a long time. And she started explaining things before I even finished reading, telling me her lawyer said this would be quick and painless, that we were mature adults and didn't need to make a mess, that I'd be taken care of, comfortable but not spoiled. Those were her exact words. And then she smiled slightly and said I should be grateful, as if she were offering me a favor instead of dismantling my life. And that word hit me harder than anything else she had said up to that point. Because gratitude implies generosity, and there was nothing generous about what she was doing. It was cold, calculated, and based entirely on assumptions she had never bothered to verify. And as she kept talking, outlining plans she had clearly already discussed with her lawyer and advisors, talking about selling the house, dividing assets she believed she controlled, rearranging a future in which I barely existed, it became painfully clear that she wasn't asking for a divorce. She was informing me of one. And she spoke about me like I was already gone, like I was a technical detail that needed to be processed, not a man sitting across from her who had shared half a lifetime. And what struck me most in that moment wasn't the betrayal itself, but how comfortable she seemed in it, how certain she was that she held all the cards, that she understood the game better than I did, and that certainty gave me a strange sense of calm, because certainty without understanding is fragile. And as she paused, waiting for a reaction, I asked her one question, just one, and I kept my voice steady, calm, as if I were asking about the weather. Do you know where our primary accounts are actually managed? And she didn't even hesitate. She waved her hand dismissively, barely looking at me, and said her advisor had everything covered, that I didn't need to worry about details anymore. And that was the exact moment something inside me settled. Because in that casual dismissal, I saw the full extent of her ignorance. Not ignorance in the sense of intelligence, but ignorance of me, of what I did, of how deeply and carefully I had protected us over the years. And I realized she had mistaken trust for ignorance. She had assumed that because I didn't talk about what I did, because I didn't boast or explain or demand recognition, that I didn't matter in the machinery of our life. And that is a dangerous mistake to make, especially with someone who has spent decades thinking about worst-case scenarios and building structures to survive them. And as she continued explaining how things would go, how fair it all was, how reasonable she was being, I felt my heart pounding in my chest, hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. But my mind was clearer than it had been in years, stripped of hope, stripped of illusion, operating purely on reality. And I knew arguing in that moment would only give her what she expected. An emotional reaction, a defensive posture she could frame as weakness. So I didn't give her that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct her assumptions. I didn't reveal anything. I signed nothing, not a single page. And when she finally stopped talking and looked at me, waiting for acknowledgement, I nodded once slowly, not in agreement but in understanding, and I stood up, pushed my chair back and walked out of the room, leaving the papers exactly where they were. Because some battles aren't won by immediate resistance, they're won by patience and timing. And as I stepped outside into the evening air, my hands were shaking, my chest tight, but my thoughts were steady. And for the first time since this quiet erosion had begun, I wasn't confused or doubting myself. I wasn't trying to fix or save or explain. I was seeing clearly, seeing Laura not as the woman I married, but as the person she had become. Someone who believed power came from appearances and advisors and confidence rather than understanding and preparation. And I knew then that this wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the moment the mask finally came off, the day she showed her real face, and in doing so, handed me more clarity than she ever realized. Revenge doesn't have to be loud, and the older I got, the more I understood that the loud kind is usually the weakest kind, the kind that burns hot and fast and leaves nothing behind but regret. And that was never what I wanted, not for Laura, not for myself, not for the life I had spent decades building with discipline and restraint. Because this was never about hurting her physically or tearing everything down out of spite. It was about letting the truth land with weight. Letting reality speak for itself without theatrics, and once the divorce papers were on the table and the illusion finally shattered, I did what I had always done best. I went quiet and I went to work, not emotionally, not impulsively, but methodically, reviewing everything with the calm focus of a man who has nothing left to prove and everything to protect. Every account, every structure, every safeguard I had built over decades of experience. All of it legal, all of it documented. All of it designed for moments exactly like this, even if I never consciously admitted it to myself. Because when you spend your life preparing for worst-case scenarios, you don't panic when one finally knocks on the door. You open the file and start reading. And as I went through it all, I felt something close to relief. Not happiness, but reassurance. Because the systems held exactly as they were supposed to. The control mechanisms were mine by design. Not hidden, not shady, just thoughtful. Layered oversight roles, authorization chains that required specific triggers, fail-safes that prevented any single person from moving too much too fast without review. And yes, Laura had spending access, she always had. I never believed in treating a partner like a child. But access is not ownership and spending is not control. And that distinction, boring and invisible to most people, was the difference between confidence and collapse. And as I confirmed each detail, I felt my pulse slow. My thoughts sharpen, because this wasn't chaos, it was clarity, and I contacted my attorney, a woman who had known me for years, someone who understood both my temperament and my work. And when I laid everything out, she didn't interrupt, didn't dramatize, didn't inflate the situation. She just listened quietly, the way professionals do when they're assembling a picture in their head. And when I finished, she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "Daniel, you're not powerless, you're insulated." And that single word hit me like oxygen after being underwater too long. Because insulation doesn't mean invincibility. It means protection. It means time. It means options. And for the first time since Laura slid those papers across the table, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was acting, and here, where patience really mattered, because every instinct tells you to lock things down immediately, to cut access, to draw lines in the sand. But I knew better. Because sudden moves raise alarms and alarms change behavior. And I didn't want Laura changing her behavior yet. I wanted her comfortable, confident, careless. So I didn't block her, I didn't freeze accounts. I didn't confront her advisors, I let her keep spending. Let her keep living as if nothing had changed. Let her make promises based on money she didn't actually command. Let her believe her version of reality without interruption. And I watched, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the detached focus of a man observing a process unfold exactly as predicted. Because when people believe they've already won, they stop checking their footing. They overextend. They talk too much. They commit to things they can't quietly unwind. And that's when the truth does the most work without you lifting a finger. And during that time, I learned something important about myself. That my desire for justice was stronger than my desire for revenge. Because revenge wants applause and justice wants balance. And balance was all I was after, not to embarrass her publicly, not to ruin her socially, but to make sure the story she was telling herself and others finally collided with reality. And I won't pretend it was easy. There were nights I sat alone in the house feeling the weight of years pressing down on me, wondering how two people could drift so far apart without either of them screaming stop, wondering if I had stayed quiet too long, But every time doubt crept in, I went back to the facts. The structure is the preparation, and I reminded myself that emotion clouds judgment and timing sharpens it. And so I waited, mate, not passively, not helplessly, but deliberately, because waiting when you know what you're waiting for is a position of strength. And as days turned into weeks, I could see the strain beginning on Laura's side. Small cracks at first, then deeper ones. The kind you don't notice until the pressure builds, and still I said nothing, did nothing outwardly. Because this wasn't anger anymore, it wasn't pain driving my decisions, it was precision, the kind that comes from experience, from understanding systems and people well enough to know that the loudest move is often the least effective one, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back, stay silent, and let the truth walk forward on its own. Because when it does, there's no arguing with it, no spinning it, no blaming anyone else, and that was the plan: quiet moves, long game. Not to destroy, but to reveal, not to shout, but to let reality speak in its own steady, undeniable voice. The collapse didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through phone calls and half-finished sentences and pauses that lasted just a little too long. And it started about 3 weeks after Laura slid those papers across the table. 3 weeks of silence from me and confidence from her. 3 weeks where she walked through the world believing nothing had really changed except her freedom. And then the calls began, first short and sharp, then longer and strained, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard before. Confused at first, then anxious, then openly panicked as the days went on, because suddenly accounts were delayed without explanation. Transfers that were supposed to be automatic were pending with no clear timeline. Payments she had promised with casual confidence weren't clearing the way they always had. And for someone like Laura, whose entire sense of power came from certainty and control, uncertainty was poison, and I could hear it eating away at her every time she called, the edge creeping into her voice, the irritation giving way to fear, and she kept saying her advisor didn't understand what was happening, that this had never happened before, that everything was supposed to be simple. And when fear finally pushed past pride, she turned it on me, accusing me of sabotage, of playing games, of trying to punish her. And I listened without interrupting, the way I had learned to do. And when she finally ran out of steam, I spoke calmly, almost gently, and suggested she review the agreement she had never read, the structure she had never bothered to understand. And there was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind where you know someone is realizing, slowly and painfully, that the ground they've been standing on isn't what they thought it was. And from that point on, the unraveling accelerated. Meetings she had bragged about were suddenly cancelled. Commitments she had made with ease started falling apart. Excuses replaced confidence. And the people who once returned her calls instantly began taking their time. Then stopped calling back altogether. Because social circles built on shine and access are fragile things. They thrive on momentum and disappear the moment that momentum stalls. And it was almost surreal to watch from a distance how quickly her world shrank once the illusion cracked. How fast admiration turned into distance when convenience was no longer guaranteed. And then one evening, just as the sun was going down and the street outside my house was quiet, she showed up at my door. Not dressed for an event, not carrying that practiced confidence she used to wear like armor, but small, eyes red and tired, shoulders slightly hunched as if the weight of weeks had finally settled on her. And when I opened the door, she didn't launch into accusations or explanations. She just stood there for a moment like she wasn't sure she had the right to be there anymore. And when she finally spoke, her voice shook as she asked me what I had done, not angrily, not accusingly, but with genuine confusion, like someone waking up from a dream and trying to understand how they got where they are. And I told her the truth, the simplest truth, that I hadn't done anything new at all, that I hadn't moved money or pulled strings or changed the rules, that all I had done was stop protecting her from her own assumptions, stop smoothing over the gaps she never bothered to see, stop being the silent safety net she believed didn't exist. And the silence that followed wasn't angry or dramatic. It was heavy, thick with realization. And for the first time in years, she looked at me without superiority or dismissal. She looked at me like she was actually seeing me, not as an obstacle to move around, not as a fool to manage, but as a man she had misunderstood and underestimated for far too long. And in that moment I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction. I felt something quieter and more final. The understanding that the collapse wasn't something I had caused. It was something that had been inevitable the moment confidence replaced understanding. Because confidence without foundation always collapses when it meets reality. And as Laura stood there in the doorway of the life she thought she had outgrown, I realized that what she was really facing wasn't me. It was the truth about herself. And that truth, once seen, can't be unseen. And the strangest part of all was that in her eyes, beneath the fear and the exhaustion, there was something like recognition, as if she finally understood that the man standing in front of her hadn't been left behind. He had simply moved on long before she noticed. Court was nothing like people imagine when they think about divorce or revenge or some dramatic final showdown, because there was no shouting, no slamming of fists on tables, no raised voices trying to drown each other out. And in a strange way that calm made it more intense than any argument ever could. Because this was the place where stories died and facts lived. And as I walked into that courtroom on the morning of the hearing, I felt an odd sense of detachment. Like I was watching my own life from a few steps behind myself, noticing the scuffed floors, the stiff benches, the way everyone spoke a little more carefully than usual. And Laura was already there when I arrived, sitting straight back with her lawyer, dressed sharply, posture confident but eyes restless. And I realized then that this was the last place confidence alone could carry her. Because court doesn't care how you feel or how sure you are of your version of events. It only cares about what can be shown, proven and explained. And when proceedings began, there was no drama at all. Just documents being passed forward, timelines laid out piece by piece, questions asked slowly and deliberately. And as the judge worked through the case, asking for clarification, for explanations, for reasoning, I watched Laura's confidence begin to thin. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, like air leaking from a tire. Because each question exposed a gap she hadn't known was there. Each request for detail forced her to rely on assumptions rather than understanding. And when she answered, it showed her responses vague, her explanations inconsistent, her reliance on advisors obvious. And the judge noticed, because judges always do. And then it was my turn, and I didn't speak much. I didn't need to, because the documents spoke for me. Years of records, clear structure, transparent safeguards, nothing hidden, nothing rushed, nothing that suggested manipulation or deceit. Just a careful, consistent pattern of protection. And as the judge reviewed it all, I could see the narrative shifting, not in my favor emotionally, but in my favor logically, because the truth has weight when it's supported by preparation. And it became clear that I hadn't been hiding assets or playing games. I had been safeguarding them, building systems designed to protect both of us from exactly this kind of breakdown. And that distinction mattered. And with every clarification Laura was asked to give, her earlier certainty drained away, replaced by frustration, then confusion, then something close to resignation, because this was the moment her story collided with reality in front of someone who couldn't be persuaded by confidence alone. And when the ruling finally came, it was measured, fair, balanced, exactly what it should have been, acknowledging intent, structure, responsibility, and truth without favor or punishment. And there was no gavel slam, no dramatic pause. Just a final statement that closed the chapter cleanly. And Laura didn't look at me afterward, not once. Maybe because she couldn't. Maybe because she finally understood that the version of me she had dismissed never actually existed. And I didn't need her to look at me anyway. Because this wasn't about winning against her. It was about reclaiming myself. Reclaiming my voice, my dignity, my understanding of who I was outside of her perception. And as I walked out of that building into the open air, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders with every step, I realized how long I had been carrying something that wasn't meant to be carried forever. And I didn't feel happy in the way people expect happiness to feel. There was no rush, no celebration, just a deep, quiet sense of freedom. The kind that settles into your bones and tells you that whatever comes next, at least it will be honest. And for the first time in decades, that was enough. Starting over in your 50s isn't a story of triumph or glamour. It's a quiet, stubborn negotiation with yourself, the kind that demands you strip away the illusions you've been carrying for decades and confront the bare bones of who you are and who you want to be. Because at 53, with a life that had been meticulously built and meticulously dismantled around me, I learned quickly that the world doesn't pause for reflection, and neither do your mistakes or your losses, so I downsized. Not just physically but mentally, letting go of possessions, habits, and obligations that had weighed me down, simplifying my surroundings so that my thoughts had room to breathe, reconnecting with people I had neglected, friends who had faded from my life quietly while I focused on systems and structures, family members I hadn't taken the time to really see, colleagues whose respect I had assumed. And through those reconnections, through the careful rebuilding of bridges I had ignored, I began to see myself not as a man defined by failure or betrayal, but as a man capable of wisdom forged in fire, and I spent long afternoons thinking hard, not in panic or regret, but in measured reflection about who I had been. The ambitious, quiet, underestimated man whose patience was mistaken for weakness, whose silence was misread as surrender, and who I wanted to become. A man who understood that power isn't loud, power doesn't demand attention or applause. It lives in quiet confidence, in the steady knowledge of your own worth even when no one else recognizes it. And I learned that love without respect is a hollow thing, a habit wearing a mask, that too many years of habit can masquerade as devotion until the illusion finally cracks. And when it does, the world demands you either fall apart or stand taller, and I chose the latter. Learning that silence can be strength, but only when you know precisely when to break it. When to let your presence be felt without drama, when to let the structures you built speak louder than words ever could. And rebuilding at this stage of life was a slow, deliberate process, requiring patience I had long since perfected. Because patience, I realized, isn't just waiting, it's planning, observing, preparing for moments when others underestimate you. Moments when reality catches up to arrogance, moments when quiet action speaks volumes, and I move through those months with measured steps, reclaiming routines, establishing boundaries, reconnecting with the things that had given me genuine satisfaction. And through it all, I noticed a shift inside, a shedding of bitterness that I had expected would cling to me like a shadow, replaced instead by clarity, by wisdom, by a steady understanding that the mistakes of the past, the betrayals endured, and the silent victories won were all lessons, not scars. Lessons that allowed me to walk into each day with calm authority. An authority that wasn't visible or loud, but unmistakably present to those who truly mattered. And I realized that rebuilding isn't about proving anything to the world. It's about proving to yourself that you're still whole, that the years behind you are not a chain but a foundation, that the quiet decisions you make now, the systems you maintain, the patience you exercise, are the real measures of success. And as I settled into this new chapter, downsized apartment with familiar sunlight streaming through the windows, conversations with friends I had once overlooked, afternoons spent reading and planning quietly, I understood that the life I was reconstructing was not a copy of what I had lost. It was something truer, built not on illusions, not on assumptions of control, not on being seen, but on being understood by myself. And in that understanding, I found freedom, not the kind that comes with victory over someone else, but the kind that comes from knowing your worth, your capabilities, your resilience, and realizing finally that wisdom at 53, born from betrayal, patience, and silent strategy, is a power far greater than any attention, any applause, or any superficial recognition. Because it is the power to move forward with clarity, with calm, with dignity and tact, knowing fully that the past shaped you, but it does not define you, and that rebuilding after betrayal isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming your life, your choices, and your identity, quietly, deliberately, and with a newfound strength that no one can ever take away.
Here's the lesson, plain and simple, and it took decades of experience, betrayal, and quiet observation for me to really understand it. Because life doesn't hand lessons on a silver platter. It hands them in the form of circumstances that test your patience, your perception, and your ability to see people and situations as they truly are rather than how you wish they were. And the first truth I learned is never confuse kindness with weakness. Because there is nothing weaker than underestimating someone who has spent a lifetime cultivating restraint, thoughtfulness, and the ability to act at the precise moment when action is most effective. And kindness is not the absence of power. It is the discipline to hold it back until the timing is right. A lesson I only fully appreciated when Laura, someone I had loved, trusted, and supported unconditionally, tried to define my life by assumptions she had made from observing only what she wanted to see. And the second truth is never assume quiet means clueless, because silence is often a shield, a deliberate choice, a way to observe without interference. And when you combine quiet with knowledge, experience, and preparation, what appears to be passivity can in reality be the most formidable form of strength imaginable. A lesson I realized when the confidence Laura displayed so freely collapsed simply because she had never accounted for the unseen structures, legal frameworks, and long-term safeguards I had carefully placed over decades, systems that worked precisely because I had been underestimated, because I had allowed people, even my own partner, to believe I was irrelevant, powerless, or disinterested. And the third truth, which ties the others together, is never build your confidence on someone else's back. Because arrogance thrives only when the other person plays a supporting role willingly or unknowingly, and when that support is suddenly withdrawn or redefined. The illusion crumbles quickly, leaving the presumptuous party exposed, confused, and often unprepared to face reality. A reality I witnessed firsthand when Laura assumed control over accounts, assets, and decisions she believed were hers to command, only to find that her confidence and social charm meant little when confronted with structures she had ignored, agreements she hadn't read, and a patient, deliberate, quietly observant man who had already anticipated this moment for years. And it was in that moment, standing back and watching her face register comprehension and shock, that I understood the most important lesson of all, which is that patience, when combined with knowledge and discipline, is a weapon far more effective than anger, confrontation, or ostentation, because it allows the truth to emerge on its own without distortion. And when it does, it lands heavier than any argument, louder than any shout, and deeper than any threat. And the strangest part is that in this approach there is no cruelty, no desire to hurt anyone needlessly, only a calculated awareness of cause and effect, a recognition that consequences are natural outcomes of misunderstanding and neglect, and that the person who underestimated you or tried to take what wasn't theirs will eventually confront the reality of their assumptions without you having to force it. And I know now that being called broke and powerless by someone you've trusted and shared decades with is not actually about the words themselves. It's about how people perceive value, control, and presence. And sometimes the loudest, most confident voice in the room is the one that understands the least, while the quiet, patient, underestimated individual is the one who truly knows, who truly holds the reins, and can, if necessary, act decisively at exactly the right moment. And that is the power I discovered in myself, the one that had been there all along but cloaked in silence and calm observation. And the final, overarching lesson, the one that ties kindness, quiet strength, patience, and deliberate action together, is that life is not about showing off, dominating, or proving yourself to others in ways that can be easily measured. It is about understanding the systems around you, preparing quietly, observing without distraction, valuing your own judgment over public approval, and acting at the right moment to preserve integrity, security, and self-respect. And that is what this entire journey, 30 years of marriage, betrayal, quiet strategy, patience, and ultimate reclamation of control, taught me. That patience, mate, is a dangerous thing in the hands of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. And when wielded with clarity, foresight, and restraint, it doesn't just protect, it restores, it corrects. And it teaches those who underestimated you what real strength looks like. And it does so without shouting, without cruelty, and without a single wasted moment. Because true power is invisible until it needs to be seen. And the lessons of life, betrayal, and patience are not found in loud revenge or anger, but in the quiet, deliberate mastery of yourself and your circumstances. And when that mastery finally meets the assumptions of those who doubted you, the truth lands heavier than any force, clearer than any argument, and deeper than any resentment, leaving nothing but reality in its wake. And reality, my friend, is the strongest teacher you'll ever have, and the one that shows you with undeniable clarity who was truly holding things together all along.